Scott is the author of a new book called Covering Ukraine, the Scott Ritter interviews through the eyes of Anya Kay, who has a wonderful YouTube channel herself covering mostly geopolitics. And they have compiled their interviews, and it's a great book. The link is in the video description, and I believe it's a great jumping off point for this conversation. So, Scott, the NATO summit is, has come and gone. The declaration has been released. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how this book can help us understand what happened, because there were, of course, a flurry of announcements. I think much to the chagrin of Zelensky, there was no guarantee of NATO membership for Ukraine, but there was a lot announced at this NATO summit. Most of it, if not all of it, really bad for humanity. So, Scott, if you could, perhaps you could talk about this book in the context, given that I love to do this. NATO was mentioned 109 times in the in the book. So talk about how this book can help us understand what happened at the summit.
Well, first of all, thanks for that statistic. NATO mentioned 109 times. That's pretty awesome. What we're seeing right now is this NATO summit was a culminating moment. I mean, it's one of those critical junctures of aligning policy with reality, with politics and the war. Everything is you got this intersection taking place in Washington, D.C. This summit is the 75th anniversary of NATO. So right off the bat, there's political pressure on the part of the NATO attendees to ensure that NATO comes across as the most politically relevant alliance imaginable. I mean, NATO's never been stronger, we're being told. There's never been more unity than has, and this is an existential moment for NATO that as goes the conflict with Russia and Ukraine, so goes NATO. If Russia wins, NATO loses, and NATO may not survive. So, we have a simultaneous posturing of strength, how strong NATO is, and yet the recognition that NATO is extremely fragile, and its future, it literally hinges on what happens in Ukraine, and what happened in Ukraine isn't good for NATO. We see them talking about providing air defense. We see them talking about providing F-16s. The F-16 was a big thematic in this summit. But we also see other things, such as it's become apparent, and the Wall Street Journal reported on this, that NATO is incapable of producing the materiel needed by Ukraine to stay the course against Russia. That Ukraine, simply put, is losing material at a far greater rate than NATO, than the European defense industry, than the United States defense industry can replace it. And that it's going to take a long time for NATO, for Europe, for the United States to get their defense industry up to the point where they could possibly do this. And Ukraine simply doesn't have that time. We are at a crisis point in this conflict. Now, that is a lot to put on the table. And for people who are looking at the NATO summit, trying to put it into context, that's a big challenge. This is why Anya and I did this book. I mean, Covering Ukraine is literally that, covering this war. There's a whole bunch of people out there who have questions, good questions. Some people get intimidated. They're like, I don't want to ask a stupid question. Well, the only stupid question is the question you don't ask. The whole concept of empowering yourself with knowledge and information is to, seek out knowledge. And the best way to seek out knowledge is to ask questions of people who are in a position to hopefully provide some sort of coherent answer. And I like to imagine that at least on some aspects of this conflict, I could be one of those people. Well, Anya Kay is not a military expert. She is literally every man or every woman, every person. She's just an average citizen. She has one heck of a of a podcast, and her YouTube channel is wonderful, but it's, it wasn't envisioned to be a YouTube channel to pursue geopolitics or military topics. It was more of a soulful, expression of, the world through the eyes of this wonderful person, Anya Kay. But now she, like everybody else, is thrust into a situation where war has been brought upon us, and she has questions. And she brings people on and she asks them questions. And she has been asking me questions about the Ukraine conflict from the very beginning of the conflict. And her questions aren't, the gotcha questions or, the wannabe expert questions that a lot of people pose. Her questions are literally questions that the average person on the street would answer, with soul, because she is a very spiritual person. And so her questions they come from that foundation. And I've found that her interviews are some of the more difficult interviews to do because she demands a lot of me, not, by, force saying you must do this, that, and the other thing. Just her questions are so probing that, you have to dig deep inside to answer them, because it's not just about throwing facts on the table. It's about throwing perspective. And when I was asked by my publisher to do a book on Ukraine, they were looking for the classic, John Erickson, The Road to Berlin, The Road to Stalingrad, some sort of, very detailed academic-oriented military analysis. And there were two things. One, I didn't have the time to do that. And two, this Ukraine conflict's been a moving target. The first time my publisher wanted me to commit to a date was to submit a manuscript in August of 2023. 2022. And I said, I don't want to, but I agreed to it. And then I pulled it the last second. I said, this isn't going to work, because whatever I'm writing right now, when you publish it, it's going to be outdated immediately. And sure enough, in September, 1 month after I pulled the manuscript, Ukraine launched its major counteroffensive that pushed the Russians out of Kharkov, eventually led to the capture of the right bank of Kherson, and then prompted the partial mobilization, 300,000 Russians, the transformation of Russian defense industry, the referendum that led to, the absorption of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk into Russia. Sort of a game changer, changed everything. Had I published that book at the time, or submitted that manuscript, that book would have been destined for the shredder or the fireplace by the time it got printed and was able to be distributed, because it would have been out of date. And that's the problem, that anybody trying to write that kind of detailed analysis is literally chasing the tail of this war, and you're not going to catch up till this war is over. It's that complicated of a war. But the questions are there. And I said, why don't we do an interview-based book? I had done one in the lead up to the Gulf War with William Rivers Pitt, a fantastic journalist who unfortunately died in 2022. But he interviewed me, and then we published a book called War in Iraq, What Team Bush Doesn't Want You to Know. It was a great success because short book, thin book, approachable book, and it answered the questions. People had questions about what's going on with Iraq, with weapons of mass destruction. It was laid out there. And the book has withstood the test of time. That's what I really like about it. And I said, why don't we do an interview-based book? But then the question came, who's going to interview, and what are the questions going to be asked? And then it becomes a question of time commitment, et cetera. And one day I was in the middle of this interview with Anya, and she's asking me questions, and the light bulb went off in my head. And I went, we already have the book. Anya and I have written this book already. We just didn't know it. She's been asking me the questions since day one. And so we captured the questions. We put them together in this book. We put it out there. If you read this book, it will take you from A to Z chronologically, from the beginning of the war to where it is. And it covers every aspect of this. It covers NATO. It covers potential for nuclear war. It covers drone warfare. It covers the economy. It covers, everything, the war, what the fighting's like, the Battle of Bakhmut, et cetera. And it's a one-stop shop. It's approachable. You read this, it's 120 pages, and you capture it. And you'll go back and reread the chapters because it becomes a reference. This is a very approachable reference. And the beauty of it too is that, each interview, we took a question from that interview, but there's an interview, and sometimes these interviews go on for more than an hour. So at the end of each chapter, we put a QR code embedded in the document, and the reader can take their cell phone, latch onto that QR code, and you will then have the actual interview, and you can watch it. So it's a multimedia experience as well. It's not just the book and the interview, but it's the podcast itself. It's a chance for Anya K's genius as an interviewer to shine. So if you want to know about what's going on with the NATO Summit, if you want to know about what's going on with Ukraine this summer, a good place to start, if you have questions, is to go to a book that's based on the very questions you're probably asking.
Yeah, indeed. And it's a kind of a piece of history, really, that, as you said, Scott, is ongoing. That's what makes writing a book about this particular topic something that doesn't necessarily have a finality to it. We don't know exactly how this conflict will end. We've been talking about exactly where we think it's going to go and what trajectory this conflict is on. But this book really does provide that slice of history that can help us understand what happened at this NATO summit, which one of those things, Scott, was these air defense systems. I think Zelensky was begging for something like seven new air defense systems that could supposedly beat back what Russia is doing with its, glide bombs, and it just absolutely wreaking havoc on the front line. Could you talk about what NATO promised here to Ukraine at the summit? And given that you did, with Anya, provide this slice of history, what does history tell us about what NATO thinks it accomplished at the summit versus what it actually accomplished at the summit?
On the eve of this summit, there was an event, a tragic event in Kiev. The Russians had launched a cruise missile attack against the Artyom, munitions, a military-industrial facility located in the center of Kiev. Adjacent to it is a children's hospital. 5 Kh-101 missiles were aimed at this facility, and 5 hit the facility, in effect destroyed it. There was a 6th explosion. It came in from a different direction. It appears that it probably is a Ukrainian air defense system. The Ukrainians are claiming that it's a Russian Kh-101 that was off target, but the Russians say every missile we launched hit its target, that this is something else, probably a NASAMS type air defense surface-to-air missile. And the Russians were very specific. They said this was provided by Norway. It's a joint Norwegian-American program, but Norway has provided some systems. The United States, they said this is provided by Norway, which implies they know where it was fired from and they know the trajectory that it flew on. If you dissect what happened here, the Ukrainians have insufficient air defense right now. When we being the collective West, first started providing air defense systems to the Ukraine, they had an integrated air defense that was comprised primarily of Soviet-era S-300s, Buks, et cetera, in place. And so the idea was to strengthen it with more capable Patriots. You bringing in NASAMS. The Germans had, I guess they call it the Iris-T. The French were bringing in Mistrals and some other, the Mamba system. They're bringing these in, but these could be brought in, installed, have the radars set up underneath this umbrella. And then they would be given a sector. And the idea is that they would enhance Ukraine's air defense. And look, they're not bad systems, and they were shooting down, not all, but I think the Ukrainians have been exaggerating, but they were shooting down some of the systems that Russia was sending in. Then Russia carried out a systemic suppression of enemy air defense campaign that should be studied throughout history if we all survive this, if there isn't a nuclear war, on how to do this. They basically dismantled the Ukrainian air defense systems to the point where they've been stripped bare. Why did 5 Kh-101s which previously have been successfully shot down, why did they reach their target without any interdiction? Because the Ukrainians don't have an integrated air defense system capable of covering these targets. They have taken Western systems, because all the S-300 systems are pretty much destroyed. That integrated air defense umbrella has been dismantled. They brought in Patriots, NASAMs, Iris-Ts, Mambas, and they install them, but they can't operate them the way they need to be operated. An integrated air defense system has the ability to detect launch, track launch, guide missiles to incoming, and shoot them down. But when you lose this and the Russians are able to penetrate and come in, if you start scanning with your radar, you are emitting a signal that will be detected and you'll be destroyed. So what happens is you have to set up sort of a cheat system. You have your launchers here. You'll have a radar here, but it's going to be off. You're going to have another radar here that's turning on, but you're going to only turn on for a little bit, then shut it down. Then another one over here has to be turned on, and you're trying to collect the picture and get a picture of what's happening. And then at some point in time, say, okay, now we're going to shoot. So you fire the missile, then you try to get a radar lock. But if you miss, that missile's just going stupid. This is the kind of makeup stuff that the Ukrainians are doing with air defense right now, because they don't have the ability to have a fully functioning, 100% coverage air defense system anymore. And so they're playing games. And so this NASAMS missile was fired, and I think the Russians have the data. I know NATO has the data. NATO knows exactly what happened. That's what's so frustrating about all this, is that Ukraine and NATO know that the story that they're telling about this being a Russian missile is a lie. Look, if it wasn't a lie, release the data. I mean, the Russians if this is a lie, then Russia made a huge mistake going to the Security Council and committing to this line of thinking publicly like that at that forum. This is the chance, if Russia's lying, to expose the lie, to undercut Russia so that they'll never be believed again. And so what would you do? You have radar data. You can say, no, we track these missiles in and show the radar data. But that's classified, Scott. Hey, man, this is strategic think we're talking about here. Everybody knows how air defense radars work. Expose the data, expose the lie, cut the Russians down right before the NATO summit. Great propaganda victory. Let's do it. They're not releasing the radar data. When KAL 007 was shot down in the early 1980s, we released, top secret intercepted communications of the Russian pilots, which showed that they knew what they were doing when they shot this airliner down. We released it because it was important to contradict what the Russians were saying. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets said, well, we don't have any missiles in Russia. U-2 photographs were put up there showing the missiles. Here's the chance. If we've got the data, why not go to the Security Council and say, no, here's the radar data. This is what happened. This is the radar picture. We know exactly what happened. And, oh, by the way, here's the forensics. These are the missile pieces that we picked up. And we were smart enough that when we went in there, we did a chain of custody. So we have it videotaped, photographed. We sealed it with a seal. We tracked it. It was under, positive control. And here are the pieces. And that serial number, that, it's a KH-101 missile. I'm telling you, that's what I used to do as a weapons inspector, is that kind of forensic analysis. Give me an hour and a half at that site. I'll tell you exactly what missile struck it. That's how easy it is, because it's not hard. I mean, it is rocket science, but there are people who understand rocket science, and they can do that. But that's not what's happening. They're just simply throwing words out. Russia, the Ministry of Defense has committed to this being Ukrainian air defense. A Russian ambassador whose business it is not to get his nation embarrassed has briefed based upon this. There's a high degree of confidence on the part of the Russians, which tells me that they are backing their words up with reality. They don't need to prove anything. They know what the truth is, so they don't need to compromise their intelligence systems. They're comfortable with the fact that Ukraine will never be able to produce the data necessary to demonstrate other than what the Russians have said. This is a tragedy that happened because Ukraine can't defend itself, that the Russians have defeated the Ukrainian air defense system. And no matter what we provide them, understand this, whatever we provide them has to come into Ukraine without an umbrella of air defense. So as it enters, it's going to be tracked. As it gets set up, it's going to be tracked. If they try to turn on their radars, they're going to be destroyed. They may be destroyed before they have a chance to turn on their radars. These systems that are being provided have zero life expectancy. They will all be destroyed by the Russians. And even if they're installed, the way the Ukrainians have to install them is you can't have them out defending the outer perimeter, because in order for that to work, you're going to have to turn on the radars. You have to have mutually supporting radars. They'll be detected. They'll be destroyed. You're going to be setting up missile ambushes by bringing the systems into the city and playing tricks, as I described earlier. And unfortunately, when that happens, the missiles are going to hit civilian targets, which is probably what happened the other day. The emphasis on air defense at the NATO summit just underscores the reality that Ukraine has no air defense right now, that they're basically at the mercy of the Russians, who can pretty much attack any place, anytime that they want to with any weapon system they want.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.